Good. Welcome to the FlexPro's third quarter webinar on managing external partners. My name is Richard Ellis, and I'm the Manager of Marketing and Business Development for today. Before we get started, I'd like to get you familiar with the platform we're using today. On the right side, you'll see three tabs, chat, questions, and polls that you can utilize throughout the duration of the presentation. Number one, I'd like to ask you to use the Q&A section to ask questions that'll be addressed at the conclusion of the webinar. If you just want to interact with the team and get to know the people in the webinar a little better, feel free to use the chat. And then finally, you can see the polls tab. You'll be able to give us some feedback, answer some questions, and ultimately make this a little bit better value for you as you move forward. In conclusion, the recording of the webinar will be emailed out to everyone who is registered. So even if you didn't catch this live, you can see it via email or watch a replay at the conclusion of the webinar. Today's webinar is brought to you by the FlexPro Group, focusing on project management for the life sciences. We are delivering project management expertise to the life science industry, and you can follow us at www.theflexprogroup.com. Also check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. A little bit more about who we are. As I mentioned, the FlexPro Group is a project management consulting firm focused solely on the life sciences. We have concentration in the pharmaceutical, biotech, and med device sectors. Headquartered in the Greater Philadelphia area since 2008 and have recently opened up a second office in Bridgewater, New Jersey. We help companies both large and small move from development all the way through to commercialization with expertise in the areas of product development and commercialization, supply chain optimization, integration management, and early stage acceleration. Your speakers today, in addition to myself, will be Rose Cook, CEO of the FlexPro Group, and Senior Project Manager and PhD Terry Fico. And finally, learnings for today, key elements in managing an external partner relationship, best practices and techniques to employ, case studies to demonstrate how employment of these best practices have paid off in the past, and then finally, a little bit how we do things here at FlexPro. So with that, I'd like to introduce Rose Cook, CEO of the FlexPro Group.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. To get us in the right frame of mind, I'd like to read a quote from Henry Ford. Coming together is a beginning, staying together is progress, and working together is success. Working together with external partners can be challenging, but these partnerships are absolutely integral to success. And for those of you who follow FlexPro, you may have seen that we participated in an industry event called Outsource Pharma in Philly recently. And to give you a sense of how critical our outsource partners are to this ecosystem in pharma, this conference is also held annually in Boston, San Francisco, and San Diego. And during this conference, a key discussion topic there was project management. In fact, I was a panelist for a session called Project Managers on the Front Lines. And as PMs, we really are on the front lines in making sure these key relationships with external partners work well so that we meet our ultimate goal, which is getting life-changing therapies out to patients. And the success stories that were highlighted focused on how strong these partnerships were. And of course, we all shared best practices, like we will here in our webinar. So now what I'll do is I'll turn it over to Terry Fico, Senior Project Manager for FlexPro, who will share some of these practical tips and examples.
Thank you, Rose. So why external partnerships? Why do we have them? Well, there are some advantages. Efficient resource, access to technologies that are specific or expertise that are otherwise unavailable to us, and the ability to transfer risk to the partner best suited to mitigate that risk. The ability to focus, grow, and exploit our core proficiencies. And then the potential to reduce cost via utilizing the partner's expertise. Now, with any relationship, there are disadvantages. Of course, there's the complexity of entering into the relationship and managing the relationship. There's less direct control over the project. It's going to require greater coordination, communication, and governance. And you're going to have to put some resources towards those activities. And then In any partnership, one must address ownership of IP. And that should be discussed as well. Managing external partnerships effectively is essential for success. Employing practical techniques helps each partner and their teams achieve individual and mutual goals. Now, at the heart of managing an external partnership is, first of all, choose the right partner, and then build strong working relationships at all levels, all while communicating effectively. Now we're going to discuss 5 best practices: understanding and choosing the right partner, defining the statement of work, the contract and scope change process, assigning accountability and responsibility, establish metrics and health of relationship checks, and then communication. Now, let's first talk about understanding and choosing the right partner in more detail. In general, the partner's strength should be your weakness and vice versa. But more than that, one must understand who you are partnering with. Aside from your common goal, what are your individual goals? Are they mutually exclusive? Compare and understand similarities as well as differences in national, regional, and corporate cultures, organizational style, decision-making processes, risk tolerance, and work patterns. You are available 24/7, evenings, weekends, and you're partnering with someone who considers weekends and evenings off limits. You're going to need to address those differences. Now, let's review a few 4-box models that can be of assistance in understanding and choosing the right partner. This first model we'll discuss is the Kralik purchasing model. It's a well-established supplier selection tool. The model is typically used for determining the best supplier when purchasing materials. However, it is useful when looking at third-party manufacturing services, depending upon the uniqueness of the capability or service. Now let's look at the slide in a bit more detail. This model measures financial risk of the purchase on the y-axis versus supply risk on the x-axis. Starting in that upper right-hand quadrant, when both financial risk and supply risk is high, you're going to want to seek a strategic relationship where the risks are balanced for both parties, and that translates into true partnership. One moves counterclockwise, where financial risk is high, but supply risk is low. You're going to want to invoke competition and leverage the situation to one's advantage. When both financial and supply risk are low, and you're in that lower left-hand quadrant, then typically the selection of the partner is not critical. Finally, when financial risk is low, but supply risk is high, then one is going to move to ensure supply. You're going to want to think about more than one supplier or partner. Now, let's look at the partner assessment model. It's also critical to understand how your partner views you. The partner assessment model helps to assess whether you are of value or a nuisance to the external partner. Now let's take a look at this slide. In this model, we're evaluating your account's attractiveness to the partner versus the relative value of the business to the partner. If your business is both unattractive and unimportant from the partner's perspective, not from yours, but from their perspective, that lower left-hand quadrant, it may be classified as more of a nuisance account, and it is not going to receive the level of support that you may be expecting. The more attractive your business is to the partner, the more attention your business is going to receive, and the partner is going to look to develop the relationship or make it core to their business. Now beware. Value, or your dollars spent with them, does not necessarily equate to attractiveness. If your business does not enhance the partner's core and future growth values, then you may be viewed as an expendable income stream. Now, it's more important to be a strategic fit as a core or developmental client than to just have a large book of work. Now, the next best practice is to define and negotiate the statement of work, contract, and scope change process. It's critical to establish the statement of work at the very outset and clarify the change order process, approval authority, etc. Detail and firm requirements planning upfront will prevent confusion and delay later in the project. Third, assign accountability and responsibility. Every task, every deliverable should have a single team member identified by name accountable for the delivery, not just filling in the RACI with CRO or vendor or some other euphemism. Encourage the external partner to provide and be accountable for their expertise. Making them accountable fosters a sense of ownership of their own processes and capabilities. Fourth, establish metrics and health of relationship checks during all phases. You're going to want to align on quantifiable metrics that measure appropriate and acceptable performance, as well as the health of the relationship. These can be tied to a formal communication plan, establishing who and what communication method, and the frequency required to discuss metrics and relationship health. And last, but certainly not least, is communication. Communication is the bottom line critical success factor, without which a partnership will not work. How and when do the parties communicate? Can it be accommodated by both parties? Establish a joint communication plan and then follow it. As the PM, it is important to encourage peer-to-peer collaboration. This facilitates communication. It establishes an us mentality versus a they or them mentality. And ultimately, it is going to spawn creativity and problem solving. Establish a personal working relationship with your project management counterpart. Establishing an honest, trusting, respectful relationship helps ingrain a sense of teamwork. And more importantly, it will make communicating bad news easier in the future. Establishing trust takes work and time. So make the time. Get to know your counterpart. Speak and communicate with them frequently at the beginning of the partnership and then regularly throughout the project. Now we're going to switch gears. We're going to discuss a couple of different case studies to see how these best practices can be applied in different partnership situations. Our first is an alliance case study. It demonstrates the importance of understanding the partner's culture and risk tolerance. We're going to see how best practices assisted in this situation. Now, the situation is a drug co-development between two mid-sized companies, one based in the United States and the other in Europe. The outline of the partnership was agreed to. The business development folks agreed to the general outline. But the timeline, the overall project plan, the budget, those were going to be delivered by the joint project team within the first 2 months of the partnership. Now, the challenge was the German half of the joint project team presented their proposal for development, including timeline and cost, on the very first day of the very first joint development team. They expected their U.S. counterparts to agree, to just sign off. Now, why? What was the root cause here? Well, it seems that this company had a significant adverse experience due to not performing some safety studies much earlier in its history. Their risk aversion, especially as it related to safety, was extremely high, and it drove them to very conservative planning. Now, how was this addressed? Well, the project managers from both companies had the insight and experience to halt the project team meeting. They took a time out. They shared their respective companies' backgrounds, their culture, their history. It highlighted both the cultural and risk tolerance differences and the need to reset expectations about the development plan, the time of spending, the budget, the duration of the overall project plan. In taking the time to better understand one another's backgrounds was a breakthrough from which yielded a development plan that both partners could support. The U.S. partner then understood the need to put more of the budget early in the development plan in phase 1 and preclinically to establish safety. Well, the German team could thus support concurrent multiple activities in the later phases, phase 2 and phase 3, thus keeping the overall timeline in line. Understanding corporate cultural differences, especially as they relate to risk tolerance, was critical in moving this partnership forward to craft a mutually agreeable development plan. Our second case study is a CMO case study, which demonstrates the importance of establishing the sponsor-partner project management personal working relationship. We're also going to see how best practice is assisted in this situation. Now, here we have a technical transfer from the sponsor to a late-stage CMO for phase 3 and commercial drug manufacture. The CMO was a small specialty contract manufacturing organization that was selected based on their expertise in this particular dosage form. A solid working relationship was established early on between key members of both the sponsor and CMO, and that included both of the PMs. The challenge was that there were mistakes, omissions, missed deadlines during the analytical method transfer, and this jeopardized the phase 3 clinical trial material readiness. Now, at the root cause, while the PM to PM relationship was well established upfront, and they were able to jointly identify competing priorities, there were insufficient resources at the CMO at the root cause. So what happened? Well, both the sponsor PM and the CMO PM met as a unified front with the senior management team at the CMO. They discussed the unacceptable project performance. They presented their root cause analysis, and then they made recommendations for corrective action. The outcome was that resources and priority adjustments were successfully made and the timeline reestablished. The establishment of trust, of a close working relationship, and an open, honest, frequent communication between the partner PMs was critical in identifying the root cause, but even more so in proposing recommendations that would likely be acceptable to both of the partners. Each of these unique external partner case studies has demonstrated common best practice elements, the criticality of understanding the partner's culture and risk tolerance, the establishment of trust and a close working relationship, as well as open and frequent communication between partners at all levels. Now, while communication is critical, the FlexPro way is also about establishing a way of working, a way of escalating, a way of prioritizing, and a way of avoiding conflict in third-party relationships, and also a way of resolving those conflicts should they occur. The FlexPro ways ensure a well-planned organizational and governance infrastructure, which is critical to support the communication plan, not only at that working team level, at project execution, but up through the management, up to the executive level engagement team. I'm now going to turn this back over to Rose for some final thoughts.
Thanks, Terry. Appreciate you sharing all those tips and tricks. I'd like to close with this African proverb, you know I like my quotes, that emphasizes the importance of partnership. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Together, in order for us to impact patient care, drive innovation, and make a difference within life sciences, external partners are increasingly important. And as you've seen with our tips and case studies, managing these relationships is critical to success. Here at FlexPro, we apply the best practices we presented here in helping clients manage projects, whether it's in a drug development program or a supply chain optimization project. We hope you found this information useful, and we, of course, welcome your questions. I'll now turn it back over to Rich Ellis to host and coordinate our Q&A session with a panel of experienced project.
Thank you, Rose. At this time, I'm going to ask the 4 faces you see in front of us to join us on stage for a Q&A. So here you will see on the right side of your screen, Mike Fahey, Senior Project Manager. Moving to the left, Liz Coco, Senior Project Manager. Terry, who just delivered that great presentation. And then finally on the right, Jim Blumenstock, FlexPro Senior Project Manager. So with that, Liz, first question is for you. I'd like to ask you, can you provide an example of when a lack of communication has created a problem or damage to an external partnership?
Yes, I can, Rich. My example was from a construction project that I was working on. The client had us building a new manufacturing construction site for him. It was within his regular operational site, though. And what ended up happening was that the general contractor and the client were both using the same set of subcontractors. So people who were doing pipe fitting work or electrical work or mechanical work. And the client department manager ended up just going directly to the subcons and directing them to do work, supporting the daily maintenance. But what he didn't realize that was happening was he was delaying his own construction project at the same time. So because there were shared resources between the two, we really needed to make sure that we were much better at our communication. And once we realized that that was a root cause of what was going on, we corrected that, and we made sure that whenever directions were being given to the subcons, that the general contractor also knew exactly what was going on, so that we weren't getting in each other's way.
That's great. Thank you. Terry, actually, same question to you. Can you talk a little bit about the breakdown of communication or other issues that you've experienced in an external partnership? Because I think the best way to learn is using actual examples.
Yes, I can, Rich. I think one of the things is that I've seen between members of a team who are working together is that they wouldn't share all of the information that they had. They would provide a segment, or they would in some way edit information they were sharing with their counterpart. And that really goes against open and complete honesty and providing your counterpart with full information. It did result in some duplication of work, and then ultimately the timeline it took a hit. That we did figure out what was going on. We did find the root cause. That information wasn't being shared fully, and took steps to remedy that relationship as well as the information flow.
Got it. Thank you very much. Mike, question to you. Can you talk about some of your strategies to maybe assess or overall work with and create an effective relationship with an external partner?
Sure, Rich. Basically, I like to utilize the 4-box models that we showed originally, really understanding how important the particular commodity, service, et cetera, is to you, and understanding how it fits into your partner's future together. Really using both of those models almost superimposed one on top of each other. Because take, for instance, you find that you're in a nuisance category. If you look at the way your supplier looks at you, that could be viewed very negatively. Nuisance is kind of a negative word. It sounds like it's not a good place to be. However, if from your perspective, it's more of a routine purchase or a routine service or a routine requirement, it's not that important to you either. So it's kind of not important to either of you. So maybe that is a good fit. Conversely, if you're in a position where you think you're leverageable and your supplier happens to see that as exploitable, you really don't have as much leverage as you thought. Maybe moving that business, if again, when you're in a leverage position, your supply risk is low, so you can move it to somewhere where that leverage actually has some power. Most importantly, obviously, is understanding. You want to get that alignment between your strategic partner married with a supplier who sees you as a core client. And really just repositioning your spend, understanding the market, figuring out how these models work together can really give you a head start as to how well you're going to work together once you get that far.
Have you found yourself on all sorts and all positions of these spectrums here?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Some tricks to get out of the situation when you're in a bottleneck. It's because you don't have with someone and they can see that as exploitable. Well, you start to combine some of that spend over different suppliers into one supplier, or find a smaller supplier where you're a bigger fish. But you really need to understand the marketplace before you start making decisions like that and how to move your business around.
Sounds great. Thank you for sharing. Jim, I'd like to get you involved over there. I see you on the right side of the screen. Can you talk a little bit about what specific or unique recommendations you'd make based on your experiences in creating a healthy third-party relationship?
Sure. That's a great question, Rich. We all know the importance of process, and as we have pushed through the PMP certification routine and regimen, we come to learn the importance of all the criticality of planning and communicating. But I think it's really, you can't overemphasize enough the importance and the criticality of creating and nurturing personal relationships at several levels within a project. I think the PM to PM relationship is critical. The peer to peer, when you have subject matter experts on both sides of the relationship, those folks have to come together. Dynamics, the culture within.
I think we might have lost Jim there.
Not hear me?
Yep, there you go.
Those dynamics are just really critical to nurture as you build them over time. Over the first couple of months of a project, you have to continue to check in. And I think some of the soft side of relationship building is important. I know geography can play a challenging part in creating relationship, but you have to try to get people together and on the same page. And lastly, I would mention another important facet of a relationship is the involvement and the sort of definition of a project sponsor. These are people in the upper management of each organization, and they have to be on the same page. Their role has to be defined. You need to have a place to escalate challenges, issues, difficulties, and there needs to be a Solomon in a project that can break a tie or can, resolve a conflict. So, make sure that you have a sponsor on both sides of your project relationship.
I think that's some great information and certainly a wide-reaching range there. Liz, I wanted to come back to you. We've talked a lot about strategy and the importance of creating these healthy third-party relationships. On the tactical side, what are some of the tactics and strategies you can actually employ to make this happen?
It's a good question, Rich. I think when I think about it, it goes back to what Terry was saying about communication. And in one of her slides, she had communication. And Jim touched it on some, having those personal relationships, knowing that you can reach out to somebody. But when I think about it, every time you have a meeting, and I'm not saying the one where you saw each other in the hallway, but where you've got a group of people sitting down, making some decisions or sharing some information, having some kind of documentation of that is critical. It might just be an email. It might be that you're using Word documents as attachments. Whatever the mode is that you're using is fine. And it'll vary some, like if it's a weekly scheduling meeting, those notes may not be as long and intense as if it's the quarterly meeting where you've got everybody from both project teams all together. But you really need to make sure you're documenting that, because it's pretty easy to forget when you're in the midst of a project, what did everybody agree to? What was going on? And that's also a way that you can hold people accountable later, because you can capture the action steps that came out of those meetings.
I think that's some great advice, and it actually links back to what Jim was mentioning about the original documents and setting that project charter and sponsor at the very beginning. So it does all connect. Mike, I want to finish up here with you. Can you talk a little bit about the way in which you're closing these relationships or maintaining them over time? I think that it's important to establish them, but can you talk a little bit about maybe how to work with them as projects or manufacturing or whatever it may be is winding down, or continuing those for future projects?
Yeah, certainly. Another good question. And again, I'm going to start with the 4-box model. I hate to be so simple with that, but really depending on where you are in each of those is the way that you would present that. If you're in a routine category, obviously you want to minimize your efforts in doing so in any kind of continuity, and you probably just want to maintain that continuity, and you get the evergreen type contracts there. If you're in a more strategic, you're going to have mutual conversations with the supplier, with that partner, on how you want to continue and what you want to put in the contract to continue. If you're more in a critical or bottleneck type of area, that's where you really need to protect yourself, because you don't have much of a position there. You're kind of at their disposal in terms of what they want to do. There's not a lot of guidance that you can provide there. So those types of situations, you really want to document. You really want to make what your requirements are clear, because it may not necessarily get the attention that it needs. So having that sort of thing documented is certainly beneficial.
Excellent. Thank you. And I guess the last question here will be for Jim. Jim, as an experienced professional, what is the most important relationship that you ever encountered? Is it, whether it's a categorical or factual example, is it manufacturing? Is it testing? Is it in the lab? What has worked for you and in over the course of your career?
Well, usually it's your counterpart, your peer on the other side of the equation. That's the person you're going to spend the majority of the time with. Yeah, there are some technical relationships that are pretty important, but if you can't nurture and build a common focus and a common, purpose between yourself and your PM peer on the other side, you're probably, going to struggle pretty much through the majority of the project. So spend time, understand the person at other levels besides the professional level, so that you have something to fall back on. You have a true relationship. You have the ability to trust the person as to what they say, when they say it, how they say it. It's really important.
Got it. And as we all know, communication is 90% of what a project manager does by the book. So I think we've heard the phrase communication and trust a lot today. I'd like to thank our panelists for taking the time to answer questions today. Thank you to Mike, Liz, and Jim. Thank you to Terry and Rose for facilitating the presentation. I'd like to invite you to follow us at www.theflexprogroup.com, on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Again, I'm Rich Ellis, and this has been our third quarter webinar on managing external partners. We hope to see you next quarter. Thanks.